Good morning, and thanks for joining us at ng-conf 2021. In 2014, we celebrated Angular for the first time at the first ever ng-conf. And now in 2021, 8 years later, we're celebrating Angular and the Angular community once again. We invite everyone to be mindful of the many people who have experienced a very trying year this last year. The first time we got together to celebrate Angular at ng-conf 2014, we celebrated with Angular 1.1, with hackathons, with an after party, and with bacon-wrapped bacon. This year, we're celebrating with Angular 11, live talent shows, speakers from around the globe, and some of our favorite music. Our first up talk is the keynote from the Angular team, and they're excited to share with us what they've been working on. Over the next 2 days, however, we've got keynotes from the RxJS team, the NGRX team, the Scully team, and the StackBlitz team. Each team has prepared new product announcements as well as sharing their future roadmap with us. Let's stop delaying, and everyone help me welcome to the stage the Angular team. Welcome Jessica Janik, Emma Twersky, and Stephen Fluin.
Good morning, Angular. That's about as much singing as you'll pretty much ever hear from me. But I just want to say I'm so excited to be kicking things off here at ng-conf 2021. My name is Emma Twersky, and I'm a developer relations engineer on the Angular team at Google. Today we're going to be talking about the idea of building a consistent experience for Angular developers. And so I just want to start off by saying, consistency probably isn't the word I would use to describe my last year, right? Personally, I moved across the country. I started a new job. My life looks completely different, right? But today, I want to take some time to talk about how the Angular team is specifically looking at building a more consistent experience for our developers. So you'll hear from a couple different people today about what consistency means at different points in the developer lifecycle. And today we're going to start off by talking about what it means for what the Angular team is specifically working on right now. So come learn what consistency means for Angular. And I think what I really want to start out by saying is, to me, what that means is going into any application, you know what you're doing, right? Angular is familiar, and we're working to make it more familiar and more consistent as we sort of bring in some new features to the framework. So if we think about the life cycle, or the circle of life cycle, we have sort of 4 steps, right? So we design a thing, and then we decide what cool things we actually want to implement, and then we go and implement the thing, right? And then it comes time to roll out that thing, and that's sort of where I come in, right? That's where developer relations is. And at that point, there's normally sort of this dichotomy, right? We have the old way of doing things, and then we have this new, cool, shiny thing. And at some point, there comes a time where we say, okay, it's time to pick one route forward, right? And we're going to utilize one way, and we're going to go forward with that. And so today we're going to talk about some different ways that we're sort of making more decisions on what the best route is going forward, and how to utilize all of the work that we've done to be more consistent going forward. So if we think about this in terms of Ivy, there were 525,600 minutes, probably maybe a few more, that went into the design and development of Ivy. Once we rolled out Ivy in version 9, we had 2 ways of doing things. You were able to select based on the Ivy-enabled flag if you were on View Engine or Ivy. We're super excited to announce that starting in version 12, we have a single way of doing things, utilizing Ivy. We'll be deprecating View Engine, and all new libraries and applications will be built with Ivy. Libraries will be following the Ivy library distribution format that we finalized in our public request for comment. You'll still be able to use View Engine libraries via ng-cc, so this shouldn't be a breaking change. Over time, you'll need to use ng-cc way less frequently, which will bring a faster, more consistent developer experience. In version 12, we're continuing to distribute Angular in the View Engine format so that libraries can still depend on Angular in View Engine. And in order to enable library authors time to update to version 12 and gradually move over to Ivy. We'll be migrating the Angular distribution to Ivy in version 13. This change will happen transparently for everyone. Just make sure that you run ng-update once version 12 is out so that you get the latest and greatest improvements in Ivy library distribution. So just wait for what we have in store for Ivy and Ivy library distribution in the future. So I already mentioned it, but the Angular linker is going to be the project name of what's bringing forward Ivy library distribution into the future. You can check out Yoast and Alex's talk later to learn what this means for those libraries, library authors, and way more about what's happening with the Angular linker under the hood. So be our guest and test out the Angular linker in V12. A few other of my favorite things that go along with this is this idea of the Ivy language surface, right? So we're now natively supporting Ivy in the Angular language surface in your code editors. What this means is that there's better type checkings, better strict typing, and we're actually using Ivy to check your Ivy code. So all of this time under the hood, the secret is that we've actually been using View Engine to check all of your Ivy code. And actually, even beyond that, we've actually had a custom template parser doing a lot of that work as well. So going forward, we're being more consistent. We're using Ivy to check Ivy, and I think that makes a lot of sense when we talk about, again, bringing consistency to the developer experience. Another thing that will help you out of your nightmare is that in version 12, we'll have strict mode by default. So in version 11, we actually introduced the option to opt into strict mode into the Angular CLI, and we found that over 70% of the community was already doing it, right? So we sort of took a look at that and decided, hey, if most of the community is already doing this thing, why not build it in as a best practice? So based on the community ecosystem, we're making it a default. So we recognize that not everybody watching this talk is at the same place in their development journey, and we want to meet them where they are. Right, so we have advanced developers and first-time developers, and we want to make sure that we're enabling people to be better developers. So by enabling strict mode, we're actually ensuring that everyone is writing similar code, that they're using the typings that are built into TypeScript to create better code. And again, we're continuing with this strategy of pushing people to be better developers and ensuring that code looks more similar because it has those strict mode typings built into it. The best part about strict mode is that it enables you to catch errors earlier on, ensuring less runtime errors in production and less production errors in general. Talking about production, we're being way more consistent with ourselves about building for production. We've always had two ways of building. You can ng-build and you can ng-build prod. And it's not super clear of the who, what, when, where, why, of when to use which one. By mistake, people accidentally use development builds in ng-build to deploy to prod applications, which is suboptimal. In order to increase consistency in the ecosystem and reduce the risk of accidentally pushing a dev build into production, we're enabling prod by default. Finally, we're defying gravity by enabling Sass in inline templating. So we'll have a new build option, inline style language, and actually just defining your style in general. And the CLI is now going to run the same transformations that it does on external resources on internal resources. So the idea here is that no matter where your Sass is, the error handling is now going to be the exact same. And that also means that they're going to have the same optimizations in prod and be transformed in a similar way with auto prefixer. So again, the idea of this consistency here is like previously it mattered where your Sass was, and if it was in line, it actually wasn't being optimized and it didn't work. So why not bring consistency to say no matter what, where your Sass is, you may as well go and use it there. Have you ever felt like you don't know what error message you're getting and what it even means? We kind of feel similarly, or at least I know I do when I see an error, especially if it's expression changed after checked. So here with error codes, we're bringing consistency to our error codes. Our error codes actually have a meaningful message style. The numbers aren't totally made up. They actually have purpose and meaning. And beyond that, we've introduced this idea of error guides. So within the most common errors, you now have links in your errors to go directly to reference documentation to help you understand how to debug that error and even what it is. And with those errors, we've actually had some videos produced that help you debug even further if you're more of a visual learner. So again, creating consistency across error messages to say, hey, we're not just going to throw an error and leave you dried out. We'll actually come and meet you where you are and help guide you through that, right? So speaking of errors, Annie is actually going to be giving a talk all about material test harnesses and what they mean, so that you can write better tests to check for things like those errors, right? And so material test harnesses are another way that we're introducing a testing method to our component library to ensure that you're testing in a consistent way and being more opinionated about the best practices of testing components. The other thing that this does is help us deliver new material implementations with a consistent experience. So we're no longer checking under the hood for specific CSS or HTML implementations with our tests, which allow us to do something like somewhere over the future Angular rainbow, we'll be migrating to this idea of MDC components. And what this is actually behind the scenes, Angular has been sort of maintaining a separate version of the material specs than the rest of them at Google, right? So this means that we're sort of in charge of our own specs that could misalign at any point. And so what we're doing is actually going and saying, let's build off of those same primitive resources, but use the same components and instead consume the guidelines as defined by the material design team to ensure that Angular components that you're using are built the exact same and off of the same specs as any sort of other material implementation. And we're making sure that they're fully backwards compatible, right? Google makes a ton of things, but this idea of unified design systems is a great way to ensure that there's a consistent experience across platform, across experience, and that we're unifying it to this idea of a core design system versus implementing our own special version or having to maintain our own specs. Finally, we're making sure that we're partnering with other teams to build a consistent experience. So we're working with the Chrome team to ensure that Angular is bringing a consistent experience to the web. And we're actually part of the full web SDK effort at Google. Right? This means that as part of the web SDK effort, we're ensuring your browser doesn't suddenly go on a spending spree and doing things like inlining our fonts for Google Fonts and our material components. We're introducing things like resource inlining and critical CSS inlining. There's a great video on our YouTube if you'd like to learn more about these things. It also means that we're actually part of the effort to define core web vitals. And you can listen to Hussein and Minko's talk later this week about what that means for Angular and the web SDK. And you can check out our new partnership to create an Angular image component with ng-Zoro and web SDK to have an image component optimized for performance on the web. Hopefully this brought a little bit of insight as to how our team is working on bringing consistency to the developer experience. Now I'm going to pass it over to Jessica to talk a little bit about what this means for the community as a whole.
Hi friends, I'm Jessica and I joined the Angular team in October of 2020. And prior to my time at Google, I worked out in the world with all sorts of front-end frameworks. And I was even building React apps back in 2019. I'm super excited to be a part of the Angular team and to be here as part of this keynote at ng-conf 2021. I'm here to talk with you about what's up with Angular in the world, so let's get right into it. We've had a lot of community contributions land in Angular recently. V12 has seen several important features land that were contributed by community members, and here are just a few examples. Huge thanks to everyone in the community who has spent their time and energy in making Angular better for everyone. Keep it up. We're thrilled to see it, and we're looking forward to seeing more. The Angular team has put a ton of effort into addressing the significant amount of issues and pull requests that have come in over the last year through something we call Operation Bylog. In total, we have over 18,000 pull requests. Many of those are from community members. Back in June of 2020, we had over 650 open pull requests sitting for us to address. And we're proud to say that as of right now, we're looking at more around 250 open pull requests. That means we can now fit the count of open pull requests into 1 byte. We worked hard to ensure that those contributions weren't just simply closed, too. The majority of those requests were merged through scripting tools that we have to ensure commits land where they're supposed to. We've made similar progress on issue triage. We've categorized and prioritized all the open issues, and we've been able to reduce the overall number of open issues to around 2,400. Now, speaking of those issues, let's talk about our feature request process. Very soon, we'll be implementing a change in our feature request process overall. We're looking at VS Code's process as an example of how to do feature requests right. If you're unfamiliar with what VS Code's process looks like, here's what that might look like for us in Angular. So the first step is an issue being submitted to our repositories. An Angular team member will manually look at and categorize the issue as either an issue or a feature request. If it's a feature request, it moves on to step 2, where we look at the request and figure out whether it aligns with our existing projects on our roadmap. And if it does, great, it gets prioritized accordingly. If not, we move on to step 3, which is open voting. During this limited period of time, anyone can vote for a feature with a simple thumbs up. Once we meet a certain threshold, it gets labeled for consideration. If it doesn't meet that threshold, it gets closed. All the feature requests labeled for consideration then get a re-review by the Angular team to see if it aligns with the future vision of Angular. If it does, it gets prioritized accordingly, and if it doesn't, it'll get closed with a detailed explanation as to why. The goal of this process is to keep Angular relevant and coherent. Right now, of the 2,400 open issues, about half of those issues are feature requests, and the vast majority of them are very niche things that we just don't plan on doing. This process will help us to better determine what are the most impactful things that will help the most people. We actually have an upcoming blog post that will outline this process in more detail. I'm being told that we've featured this topic for too long. I'm being requested to move on. I have no issue with that. Let's talk about Webpack. V11 introduced Webpack 5 support as an experimental option, and I'm happy to say that in V12, Webpack 5 is officially the default. Hi, Webpack 5! Nice hit, Emma. Webpack 5 brings some cool features we know there's a lot of buzz about. There's a lot of interest specifically about module federation, and if you're unfamiliar with module federation, it's a way of creating multiple separate builds that act as dependencies that build up to one whole application. Those dependencies can be local or even remote. If you've heard of the term micro front ends, this is one popular pattern that module federation creates. Our fantastic community has already developed content and tooling to let anyone experiment with module federation. Manfred Steyer has an entire blog series on the topic and developed extensions for the CLI that you can try out today. Definitely check that out. Okay, I've packed too much into this section. Let's move on. Let's talk about linting. TS-lint has been baked into the Angular CLI since the beginning. And as you may already know, TS-lint has been deprecated with features being added into ESLint instead. James Henry from the Angular community built tooling to integrate ESLint with the Angular CLI, and thanks to his efforts and many other folks who have helped pave the way for migration from TS-lint to ESLint, now you can use ESLint directly from a CLI builder that you can install with a few simple commands. You now have a lot more flexibility too. The ng-lint command is no longer configured right out of the box, so you can configure whichever linting solution works best for your project. Well, now that that's lint rolled up, let's talk about end-to-end testing. As you all know, Protractor has been our default end-to-end testing tool since the beginning. Since we developed Protractor, the JavaScript standard and ecosystem advanced considerably, providing modern syntax and much better development tools. Unfortunately, Protractor is unable to leverage such technologies without forcing users to rewrite all of their tests. In the meantime, more robust alternatives have emerged in the web testing space. So we released an RFC to propose a plan for the future of Angular's end-to-end testing. If you haven't seen that, definitely go check out the issue posted by Keen to see the details. So with that in mind, much like ng-lint and ng-deploy, ng-ete is no longer going to be configured right out of the box. It will instead give you options to configure your own preferred end-to-end testing solution. We work closely with the teams of popular testing frameworks to ensure smooth integration with the Angular CLI through plugins. Some of those options include Cypress and WebDriver IO. Take a look at how easy it is to set those up. Okay, we've talked about this topic from end to end. Let's talk about components. Angular Components has switched over to the new Sass module system. All the internal code inside Angular Components is using the @use syntax now. And as part of doing this, we've introduced a new way to consume the Sass API that's totally and completely optional in V12. It's very simple to migrate to. You can just run a schematic that will switch over to this optional API. It will change any places that import Sass from the Angular CDK and Angular material in your Sass to use the @use syntax. Again, this is optional, but @use offers a lot of improvements over the prior import syntax, which is no longer recommended by Sass. With @use, imports are now called modules and allow for much better scoping and scaling of your styles. You get features like private members, partials, namespacing, and more that were just not possible with the prior import syntax. We're excited about how much more flexibility this will give you in styling your applications. The main impact here happens if you're using the Node Sass npm package. In that case, it will not work anymore. The Node Sass package was deprecated in V10, support ended in V11, and it's just plain not in V12 and will break. You need to switch over to the npm package Sass instead, which is backwards compatible, and no other changes are required. So if you're using the Sass package, everything will just continue working. The new API surface renames a bunch of things so that it's easier, and as part of V12, all the documentation will be updated to reflect this. Okay, we've gotten a little too sassy, so let's talk about something else with style. One of the most common feature requests that we've been getting in the Angular CLI is for post-CSS support. To make sure we incorporate the community's feedback, we ran a survey on Twitter to find out which are the most popular options that folks requested. The results showed that Tailwind was high up on the list, so we introduced native support in the CLI for it, which landed in V11.2. This way we provided a fancy new feature that kept our internal build tooling well encapsulated and easy to modernize over time. Once you have the ngx Tailwind package installed, V12 will make it even easier to use Tailwind by detecting the Tailwind configuration in the root of the project and using it right out of the box. There's no additional work to do at all. If you'd like to learn more about Tailwind in general, check out Amadou Sal's talk, Tailwind, the Future of CSS is Here. I'm feeling we're at the tail end of this topic, so let's move on to the next topic. There's been a lot of interest in getting trusted type support into Angular for years at this point. Ever since V11 last fall, there's been an ongoing effort to land trusted type support. If you're unfamiliar with what trusted types is, it's a specification within the content security policy that works to prevent cross-site scripting attacks by restricting writing to the DOM to a specific and defined set of types instead of strings. And this is super awesome. We're evolving Angular together with the web platform by providing support for the latest security features. As of V11.2, we did actually land full support for trusted types. However, there is a bug in Webpack that actually breaks lazy loading support, and that's why we haven't announced it yet. The trusted types team is working on patches to Webpack so we can enable it for applications using lazy loading as well. Once that fix has landed, we'll finally be able to fully recommend trusted types usage. We trust you'll be patient with us on this as this gets addressed. We're not the type to let you down. Okay, that's it for me. I can hear all the groans. It's okay. It's cool. Time to hand this talk over to Steven, where he'll talk about what's up with the future of Angular.
Hello everyone, my name is Steven Fluen, and I'm really happy to be here, but I have to start off by saying I absolutely miss in-person events. I basically wish I could be in Utah or wherever with everyone and give everyone a great big hug. I love this community, and I cannot wait till we can resume in-person events, which I'm really looking forward to in the future. I want to start off by sharing a little bit about my entrance to the Angular community. So one of the big events that I spoke at a few years ago was called ng Vegas. And at this time, I was using Angular JS. I was really excited about the world, but I really wasn't with it in terms of understanding what the team was doing, understanding why they were doing all these sorts of things. And so what I did at that event was I actually went and I hunted down and I tracked down a bunch of team members and a bunch of people like David East. And I basically grilled them. And I was like, why are you doing these things? Why TypeScript? Why the rewrite? Why all these things? Why not do this? Why not do this? Why not do this? And they had really, really good answers, but without actually having gone and asked them for all these pieces of information, for all of these questions that I had, I wouldn't have really understood what the team was trying to do. And so part of what I want to do is I want to bridge that information gap and share with everyone some of the things that the Angular team is thinking about and some of the reasons behind some of their decisions so that you can understand and so that everyone can go on this journey together. One of the top questions that I've heard from a lot of developers is, why don't you just add types to forms, right? This has been one of the top items on the GitHub issue list, the top voted issue actually. And this is something that the team has been thinking about a lot for a long time. And so it kind of seems like, well, why don't you just add the types? It can't be that hard, right? But in reality, it actually ends up being a little bit harder. Types are actually very, very breaking when it comes to Angular updates. And if you look at the last few Angular updates, most of the breaking changes that developers have experienced have actually come from the addition and up-revving of TypeScript. So even when we're keeping Angular relatively the same, we're not changing mental models, paradigms, those sorts of things, even just adding new strict type configurations and better type checking is going to cause troubles for developers that are trying to stay up to date. And oftentimes these are, again, they're not even changes in TypeScript. They were things that were wrong before, but when you start identifying them, that breaks people's code. It's kind of amazing that there's this moment where you add typing to a system or you improve the typing of a system, and suddenly you're like, how did this code work at all in the past? And so this is one of the biggest challenges that the team is thinking about, is how do we add types to Angular and Angular forms without breaking the universe? Because there's a ton of value to really good typings, right? There's a reason this is the #1 request on GitHub. If you're interested, there's a few different alternatives. So if you want types today, there's great community that you can check out, like ngx forms typed, which is meant as a drop-in replacement or a drop-in extension that allows you to have the typings of forms. But this is in the roadmap, right? The team wants to do this, but they want to make sure that they're fixing it in the right way so that we don't just add types on something that's not going to actually fix the problem, or types that are going to invalidate and break everyone's code. And so there's always a balance here, and the team has this very high on the roadmap, and it's going to be something that is rolled out slowly and carefully to make sure that the types that are added have the necessary migrations, have the necessary intentional design that Angular developers expect from all the different pieces of Angular. Another question that a lot of Angular developers ask is, why don't you just make Angular more reactive? Because a lot of people really like RxJS. They wish there was more RxJS. They want lifecycle hooks that are tappable by observables, and they want more subjects. And these are all really interesting patterns to a lot of developers. But the team also gets the question a lot of, why don't you just make Angular less reactive? Why don't you remove the dependency on RxJS? If you think about, for example, an output, why is an output an event emitter versus that extends subject versus just being a event emitter that is simpler, doesn't have any third-party dependencies, all those sorts of things. And there's this kind of duality between these two questions that the team hears about a lot. And if you just look at what the team hears about, what you read about on Twitter, you've got these two giant camps. We've got less RxJS, and you've got a team group of people that wants more RxJS. But if you look at the broader ecosystem of developers out there, the situation is a little bit more complex. If you look, there's actually this middle group of developers that are like, just help us, right? Tell us what the best practices are. Tell us what the patterns are, because we want consistency. We want all of our applications to look and work the same. And this duality is a little bit confusing, where if you look at real world applications, there's a real mixture that you see out there. And we hear this a lot, that Angular's opinionation is valuable. And when you think about this idea of, should we have more RxJS or less RxJS, having a strong opinion would be valuable. But it would only be valuable for those developers if it's, so to say, the right opinion, or the opinion that they agree with. Because what we've seen is that different developers have different needs, right? There's developers that come in with no experience at all, and there's developers that come in with 20 years of experience where they're senior architects, they've seen every pattern computer science. And really, every developer has a different comfort zone. We've seen even at Google, there's a ton of developers that love ArcGIS and just want to use it. That's the mental model that makes perfect sense to them. And there's been giant email threads of senior architects at Google who say, I don't want ArcGIS, I just want promises. Just give me promises back. There's also a challenge around project size. RxJS and state management in general is generally solving a problem that is more important or more visible at larger scale when you have lots of components that need to synchronize their state and they need to communicate across the entire application. State management ends up becoming much more important in those sorts of applications. And so acknowledging that there are actually different needs out there make it very hard for the Angular team to come up with a strong opinion that is going to make sense to force everyone into. In general, what we've seen is that Angular's patterns make people more effective as developers. This idea that we're going to focus and lean into testing, this idea that we're going to lean into TypeScript really has made developers able to build larger applications that scale better. And so there's a lot of different ways that the team could respond to this. The team could say, hey, let's remove reactivity. Let's make this simpler for new developers and just make this something that is a pattern that we don't include in Angular at all. But if you do that, then you're missing out on this reactive pattern. You're missing out on this amazing things like the async pipe that just flow data from whatever state, whatever backend you've got into the template and re-render it intelligently, automatically, all these sorts of nice things. You'd be missing out on that pattern and you'd be losing this benefit that a lot of developers really, really like about Angular in terms of its reactivity. You could go the other end. You could make everything reactive, but we found that this really is confusing to beginners, right? I've had to explain so many times why HTTP returns an observable that it's clear that those messages aren't intuitive to new developers. And so there's also a layer of abstraction, right? Like when you create a reactive programming model, it's a layer of abstraction. You have to deeply understand what's going on under the hood that you have to actually learn. But maybe there's a middle ground. And so if being reactive is hard, right? Everything is across the board. Maybe we could support the bimodal distribution of developers. What I mean by that is maybe we forget about trying to be opinion and say no reactivity or full reactivity, and we instead focus on this idea that both of those universes actually make sense and encourage and support developers who want to live in one world or the other, but maybe not try and live in the middle ground where you have halfway reactive applications with state management covering parts of the application, and really focus on you kind of want a lot of reactivity or you want no reactivity. Because the idea here, again, is consistency. How do we let developers build consistent applications where when you get into a given application, you learn its best practices, and then that best practice is applied across the entire application in a consistent, cohesive way. And one of the great opportunities I think that exists in the community is to rely on teams like the NGRX team, who really are thinking a lot about what reactive Angular could be and should be. And so I love this idea that you use Angular, it's simple, maybe it doesn't have a ton of reactivity in the box, but then if you plug in NGRX or you plug in all these great reactive tools that are coming from the community, then you can live in that fully reactive world. Another important question that we get is, why don't you just get rid of zones and modules? This has been on the roadmap and under discussion for years. A lot of developers freaked out a few years ago when we started talking about getting rid of them, although other developers who are building libraries and tooling hate zones and modules. They feel like they get in the way. And so this is a big question that the community is facing. And if you look on GitHub, you can actually find a PR where Minko wrote a PR that actually makes modules optional. And so this might seem at first glance like it's a really, really easy problem to solve. But more than moving code, moving developers is hard, right? Sending a line of code or sending a PR that changes how Angular works is actually the easiest part of developing Angular. Moving the millions and millions of lines of code that exist out there, that's the much, much harder part, right? Moving the minds of developers across the world is the hardest. There's a really great author in GDE named Deborah Carrata, who I want to use as an example here. Sorry, Deborah, and thank you. Deborah is a Pluralsight author, has a really, really great course on Angular. And there was a time when we started making changes to the ng-new experience. So we had new prompts, we have new settings, new configurations that render different files to disk. And what Deborah explained to us, and she made crystal clear, and we had an intuitive sense of this, but she really made it crystal clear, was this idea that every time we make a single change to what that ng-new experience looks like, for example, that ends up resulting in millions of hours of developers having to think about the new questions that they're being asked. That results in thousands of hours of training materials, courses, boot camps, all these sorts of things, having to update and change and adapt and incorporate those changes. And so what might seem like a really simple code change ends up being this ginormous task for the ecosystem to overcome. One of my favorite analogies is this idea that software development can be measured in ecological terms, where the more time we waste of someone and the time we make a developer expend, the worse it is for the environment. And so thinking about that model really, really influences the way that we think about changing Angular, and especially when it comes to things like modules and zones, which, again, you could do it technically very easily, but making it work for applications and making it work in developers' mindsets is a far harder challenge. And there's this idea that I have where every year the Angular team has a budget, and this is a budget of how far you can move the ecosystem, how far you can change the best practices and the standards of the ecosystem. And the team is very, very cautious with this budget. They spend a lot of time thinking about this, and they say, when we change something, how does that affect the world? How does that affect the mental models of developers? And so there's things that save it, so like holding back changes, having a long deprecation timeline, making all the great automatic transitions that you have with ng-update. And there's places that we spend it, right? When we bump dependencies with this 6-month release cycle, when we released Ivy, all these sorts of things. And so understanding that balance is really important. And one of the things that we try and do is we try and base that on what we're seeing in the community. So the team is constantly listening to developers and checking what they're seeing in the community, checking what patterns and what versions are being used. And so if we play this forward, let's imagine what actually would happen if we removed modules and zones today. Effectively, you'd invalidate every line of Angular code ever written, right? Because every line of Angular code currently requires modules. It might make debugging easier because you don't have these extra layers of abstraction. It might give you less magic, right? Because we don't have zones tapping into all the events for you. It might make simple projects less complex, right? If you don't have to create modules, you can just rely on a simpler component. But at the same time, it might make simple projects more complex, right? Now that developers would have to be responsible for actually going and maintaining the change detection of their application. And it actually would make removing modules would actually make components more complex as well. A lot of developers really like the benefits of zones and modules. And so the big challenge for the team is thinking about how do we evolve Angular to solve the problems that exist with zones and modules without losing those benefits, right, of developers not having to think about asynchronous events, or without developers having to leave behind this really useful architectural abstraction of modules. And so the path forward is pretty clear at this point, although there's still a lot of room for community feedback and change here. But the idea is to move to optional zones, optional modules, possibly with one of the ideas that I'm a big fan of this idea of, in a world where you don't need modules, what if every component has the same behavior as a module, where you can actually mix and match the module world with the component world? But I can get into that another time if someone's interested. There's also clear, consistent rules, right? We need to set up the patterns of when and where you use these things, and when and where you shouldn't use these things, to avoid diverging the entire ecosystem. And sometimes the question comes up of, are these things going to be removed? Are we going to invalidate all the code? And I'll just say, I don't think that's going to happen while I'm on the team. There really should be one Angular, and this is essential to a lot of the people's mental model around Angular. So if you think about what the team's going to do going forward, the team's going to keep innovating, the team's going to keep pushing developers and the entire ecosystem forward, trying to adopt and push best practices for everyone. And they're going to continue supplying these great patterns and best practices for everyone. The team is not going to leave the world behind. This is a commitment they've made for a long time. So it's going to be about, as the team wants to and is able to deploy these things like forms and modules and whatnot, maintaining the high quality bar for everyone, maintaining ease of use, right? We don't want to get into a world where you have to say to someone, oh, you're using an out-of-date tutorial, you're doing everything wrong, your code's not going to work, your mental models are all wrong, right? Having straightforward mental models is a really, really good thing for the longevity of developers and for Angular. And then the team really wants to have one way of doing things and wants to be opinionated. But when it comes to one way of doing things, you have to think that if there are trade-offs to the one way, then we really maybe don't want to have one way of doing things, right? RxJS is a really great example. There's trade-offs between having reactive APIs for everything and having non-reactive APIs for everything. And those trade-offs are valid. You have to decide as a developer, which of these trade-offs do you want? And sometimes things aren't objective, right? There's a lot of feelings and emotion around software engineering, and it's not always clear that there is one best path. And then one final thing to think about when there's one way of doing things. One of the biggest benefits of having one way of doing things in Angular is that the team's velocity isn't impacted. And so we don't want to support N ways of doing things if it means that we have to go and support those N way of doing things in perpetuity. Also, the team wants to be opinionated, but only when the team is right about things. And there's places that the team has absolutely been right? Testing is important, linting is important, CI is important, accessibility, internationalization, automation tooling. All of these things are hard to question their importance, but there's places where there's weaker opinions, right? Which design system is right? There is no right design system. There's no right CSS framework or no perfect CSS framework. There's no perfect way of doing deployment. And so as you think about these things and even going forward, thinking about things like linting and testing frameworks, if there's not a perfect, objective, correct answer, it maybe isn't right to have a strong opinion. It's better to have a weak opinion. And so consistency is really about bringing everyone in the community along with the team on the journey. One of the smartest things I've heard on the team is that we really want to design for change. And so I think as the community moves forward, as all these tough challenges are tackled, it's really important for everyone to think about coming with us on this journey. The team has a request for comments now on a lot of the features and the ideas that the team has around browser support and implementation details. Leave GitHub issues, file comments, share your thoughts and ideas, get on Twitter, send a message, create a community event, have a conversation about the things that are going on. Send emails to your friends, to the team. Let people know. Don't suffer in silence, or don't let your opinions go unheard. There's a big challenge, which I call the silent majority of Angular developers, where most Angular developers aren't talking about the big challenges that they see and the needs that they have. And so by being more vocal, by being more active, you're going to get the whole ecosystem to drive and follow your ideas and your vision and hopefully make you more successful. And the last piece is make sure that you're doing it with love, because when you have these feedback, when you have these ideas, make sure you're trying to empathize and trying to be supportive of everything that everyone else is trying to do. And I do want to say thank you for attending ng-conf 2021. Just by being here, just by being part of this event, you're already doing it. You're already trying to drive consistency for the entire ecosystem. Thank you so much.